He was the man her family had hated for 3 generations, and now a broken roof had forced her to sleep under his own roof. If you have ever been trapped in a house with someone you were taught to despise, you already know how this story feels, so stay with me, because by the end you will understand why some feuds are never what they seem. Before we begin, if stories like this one keep you up at night in the best way, tap that subscribe button now, because there is a new tale waiting for you every single day, and you will not want to miss what comes next. In the North Study of Brenmore Hall, Nathaniel Ashgrove, the 7th Earl of Brenmore, stood before an old survey map of his land, a document drawn nearly 100 years before, its ink the color of weak tea, faded by time and candle smoke. His attention was not on the rolling fields he knew by heart, but on a single thin line, the boundary that separated his estate from the neighboring property of Hartfield, a line that had caused nothing but argument for 3 generations of his family. His steward, Mr. Wren, a man who had served the Ashgrove family since before Nathaniel was born, stood quietly behind him, waiting to be addressed. "Another letter has arrived from Mr. Quillen, my lord," Wren said, his voice low and respectful on behalf of the Hartfield estate. Nathaniel did not turn from the map, his gaze fixed on a small shaded section near the western corner, marked simply as the Ashworth Wing, a part of Hartfield Manor that had been disputed for as long as anyone could remember. "And what does Mr. Quillen claim for Miss Hartfield this time?" Nathaniel asked, his tone flat, not from anger, but from sheer repetition. "He repeats her position, my lord, that the Ashworth collection has always belonged to the Hartfield family, and that any claim otherwise dishonors the memory of her late father," Wren reported. "My father and grandfather argued this very point," Nathaniel said, his voice calm, almost weary. "The collection was held as collateral against a debt that was never repaid. The letters between my great-grandfather and hers make that perfectly clear. Mr. Quillen insists there was a later agreement that cancelled the debt, but that the documents proving it have been lost," Wren said, his tone carefully neutral, as it had been for years of repeating the same argument. "They have been lost because they never existed," Nathaniel said, finally turning from the map, his grey eyes calm but firm. "The Hartfields have pride. I understand that well enough, but pride does not give them the right to claim what belongs to my family." He walked to his desk and sat, drawing a fresh sheet of paper toward him. "Write a reply," he said. "We will not press the matter harshly, but we will not yield an inch. The claim stands as it always has." "Very good, my lord," Wren said, and withdrew, leaving Nathaniel alone with the silence of the study and the weight of 100 years of dispute hanging in the air around him. He looked again at the map, thinking of the new mistress of Hartfield, a woman he had never met, who had inherited the estate only months earlier after the death of her father. He imagined her much like her father had been, proud, stubborn, certain that the version of history belonging to her family was the only true one. To him, the matter was never about anger, it was about order, about a line on a map and a debt in a ledger that deserved to be honored correctly. He would be patient, he told himself, and, in time, the truth would settle the matter as it should. 20 miles away, in the morning room of Hartfield Manor, Caroline Hartfield sat with an almost identical letter from the same Mr. Quillen resting in her lap. The paper was crisp, the handwriting of the solicitor elegant, but the words inside were nothing but a familiar irritation, stating that the Earl of Brenmore remained firm in his ancestral claim. Her companion, an older woman named Mrs. Pemberton, who had served the Hartfield family since the mother of Caroline was alive, watched her with sharp and knowing eyes. "The new Earl is every bit as stubborn as his father was, it seems," Mrs. Pemberton said, setting down her teacup. Caroline placed the letter beside a small sewing basket on the table, her expression composed, though her jaw was tight with frustration. At 27 years old, she carried herself with a quiet strength that had been hard-earned through years of running an estate alone, her dark hair plainly styled, her features serious rather than soft, but her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and missed nothing. "He is mistaken," Caroline said evenly. "My father was clear about this matter. The debt was forgiven long ago, and the Ashworth collection belongs to Marrowfield just as surely as the roof over our heads. A roof that happens to be leaking in the West Gallery at this very moment." Mrs. Pemberton added dryly. "I know," Caroline said with a tired sigh. "Mr. Bramwell tells me the lead flashing has failed completely. It will be an expensive repair." The truth, though she rarely admitted it aloud, was that Marrowfield was slowly bleeding money. Her father had been a scholar, not a man of business, and the estate had suffered quietly under his care. Rents were low. Tenants struggled after a poor harvest, and the house itself seemed to be aging faster than she could repair it. The persistent claim of the Earl on the Ashworth collection, the single most valuable thing she owned, was more than a mere annoyance. It was a genuine threat to everything her family had left. "The Ashgroves have always wanted what does not belong to them," Mrs. Pemberton said, repeating words Caroline had heard since childhood. "They already have Brenmore Hall, one of the finest estates in the county. Is that not enough for them?" Caroline looked out the window toward the distant tree line that marked the border between the two properties, realizing she had never once set foot on Brenmore land, nor had the Earl, to her knowledge, ever crossed onto hers. They were neighbors only in geography. In every other way they were rivals, their dealings handled entirely through the careful, formal letters of men like Mr. Quillen. "It is a matter of pride for him, I suppose," Caroline murmured, more to herself than to her companion. "As it is for me." She picked up the letter again, her resolve hardening. "I will not let him believe I can be so easily intimidated. I am a daughter of my father. Marrowfield is my responsibility now, and he will find me no less firm than those who came before me." She decided then to write to Mr. Quillen and instruct him to hold their position exactly as it stood. The Earl of Brenmore, this stranger with his ancient title and his baseless claim, would soon learn that the new mistress of Marrowfield was not a woman to be trifled with. The house, the land, and the long quarrel were hers now, and she intended to defend every inch of it. The autumn storm began. That very evening a soft patter against the windows that by midnight had grown into a violent assault of wind and rain against the old stones of Marrowfield Manor. Caroline lay awake, listening to the groaning timbers and the unsettling rattle of a loose slate somewhere above her, the house feeling more fragile than ever against the fury outside. It was not the wind that finally pulled her from her bed, but a deep cracking sound followed by a heavy, rumbling collapse that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. The sound came from the west wing, from the oldest part of the manor, from the gallery itself. She was already pulling on her dressing gown when Mrs. Pemberton appeared at her door, a candle trembling in her hand, her face pale with fear. "Caroline, my dear, you must come quickly. Something terrible has happened," she said. The scene in the West Gallery was devastating. A large section of the ceiling had given way entirely, bringing down plaster, wooden lathes, and a flood of rainwater onto the floor below. Ancient beams sagged dangerously above, slick with damp, while the floor had become a treacherous mess of debris and spreading pools of dark water, the smell of wet plaster and old rot thick in the air. Her steward, Mr. Bramwell, was already there, his expression grim in the flickering candlelight. "The main truss has failed, Miss Hartfield. The whole wing is unstable now. We were fortunate this happened at night. If anyone had been inside when it fell, he did not need to finish the thought." Caroline stared at the wreckage, her heart sinking with each passing second. This was no simple leak. This was a disaster. "And the library, the Ashworth wing?" she asked, her voice tight with dread. "The collapse is in the gallery beside it, miss. But the supporting wall has been compromised. It is not safe." "None of it is safe right now," Bramwell said grimly. For a long, silent moment, she could only stare at the ruin before her. The cost of repairing this would be unthinkable, far more than the estate could possibly bear. Marrowfield was not simply her home. It was her duty, her inheritance, and it was crumbling around her in the middle of the night. The next day passed in a blur of frantic effort, buckets placed beneath leaks, furniture dragged to safety, tarpaulins pulled over what could still be saved. By late afternoon, Bramwell delivered his final verdict, and it was worse than anyone had feared. Not only was the entire West Wing now uninhabitable, but the main house had also suffered structural damage. The kitchens were flooded, and a chimney stack threatened to collapse entirely. "It is not safe to remain here." "Miss Hartfield," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was about to say, "not for you and not for any of the staff. We must evacuate until the house can be properly surveyed and secured." Evacuate. The word felt foreign in her mouth. Where could they possibly go? The dower house was let to another family. The vicarage was far too small. She had no other property to offer her people shelter. Her household staff looked to her now, waiting, trusting. She was their mistress and their provider, yet she had nowhere to take them. It was Mrs. Pemberton who finally spoke the name aloud, her voice hesitant, as though the very word were a kind of betrayal. "There is Brenmore Hall," she said quietly. The head of Caroline snapped up immediately. "Absolutely not," she said sharply. "My dear, be reasonable." Mrs. Pemberton urged gently but firmly, "It is the only great house for miles around. The Earl is your neighbor in a crisis such as this. It is simply what is done. You cannot refuse such an offer." "I would rather sleep in the stables," Caroline said, the words sharp with the only pride she had left, to become a supplicant to that man. To the very Earl trying to take the most precious inheritance of her family, the humiliation felt unbearable. "And the staff?" Mrs. Pemberton asked quietly. "Mrs. Wells, who is 60 years old, young Lily, the kitchen maid, will they sleep in the stables too?" The question struck Caroline like a physical blow, her pride suddenly seeming a luxury she could no longer afford. Their safety mattered more than her own resentment. The letter she finally wrote was the hardest she had ever composed, formal, plain, stripped of all emotion, a simple statement that Marrowfield had suffered serious storm damage and was temporarily unlivable, and she requested shelter for herself and her household until other arrangements could be made. She signed it C. Hartfield, sealed it with the old ring of her father, and sent a groom riding through the gathering dusk toward what felt like enemy territory. The reply came within 2 hours, not as a letter, but as the carriage of the Earl himself, empty and waiting, with his head coachman on the box, and a short note delivered by his footman. "Miss Hartfield," it read in a strong and steady hand, "my house is at your disposal. I will expect you within the hour. The East Wing has been prepared for you, Brenmore." There was no condescension in the words, no flourish, only a direct offer of shelter, one he could not refuse to extend, and one she could no longer refuse to accept. As she gathered her few belongings, Caroline felt a strange sense of dislocation. She was leaving her home, her fortress, to take shelter inside the very walls of the man she had been raised to consider an enemy. She armed herself with the only weapons she had left, her composure, her dignity, and a quiet, unbending pride, determined that the Earl of Brenmore would see no weakness in her, only the mistress of Marrowfield, displaced but never defeated. Let us pause here for just a moment, because if you are enjoying this story so far, please leave a comment telling me where you are watching from tonight. It means more than you know, and it helps this story find its way to more people who need a little escape like this one. The carriage ride to Brenmore Hall took only 20 short minutes through winding lanes before passing through a set of grand iron gates marked with the Ashgrove crest. The parkland beyond was breathtaking, even in the fading evening light, ancient trees standing like silent guardians over rolling hills, a swollen river gleaming like polished steel far below. Marrowfield was a fine estate in its own right, but this was power made visible in land and stone. The house itself was a masterpiece of pale, symmetrical architecture, gathering what little light remained in the darkening sky. As the carriage came to a stop on the gravel drive, the great doors swung open, and the Earl of Brenmore stood waiting at the top of the steps. He was taller than she had imagined, dressed simply in dark clothing, his only contrast the crisp white line of his cravat, his hair a deep auburn, his expression entirely unreadable. He descended the steps as she was helped down from the carriage, and for a moment they simply stood there, two rulers meeting on a contested border, the wind catching a strand of her hair and pulling it across her face. "Miss Hartfield," he said, his voice low, formal, and without warmth, "welcome to Brenmore." "Your lordship," she replied, her own voice steady, though her heart pounded against her ribs. "Thank you for your generosity. I trust we will not be a burden for long." "It is no burden," he said simply. "It is a necessity." He gestured toward the open door. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Linton, will show you to your apartments. The east wing is entirely yours for as long as you require it." It was, she understood instantly, a clear division of territory. He was offering her a wing of his house, not the run of it, shelter, not friendship, and that suited her perfectly. "You are very kind," she said, the words tasting like ash on her tongue. He gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. "I have instructed my own steward to assist Mr. Bramwell however he requires. If you need anything at all, you have only to ask Mrs. Linton." And then he was gone, turning sharply and disappearing into the shadowed depths of his own house without another word. He had not smiled, had not offered his arm, had performed his duty with the cold precision of a man completing an unpleasant but necessary task. In the days that followed, this strange and brittle peace held steady between them, Caroline catching only fleeting glimpses of the Earl walking the grounds with his dogs, a tall, solitary figure against the grey autumn sky. She spent her hours in anxious meetings with Bramwell, who brought daily reports of the destruction at Hartfield, and the news was never good, the cost of repairs growing more terrifying with each passing day. One afternoon, seeking a moment of relief from the grim numbers, she found herself outside the door to the Brenmore Library, technically neutral ground between their two warring households. Inside, she discovered shelves filled not with novels or poetry, but with practical volumes on agriculture, drainage, and estate management, the margins filled with notes written in the same strong hand from his letter, not idle scribbles, but sharp, intelligent questions and calculations. She realized then that this was not a man of leisure concerned only with titles and old grudges, but a man who studied his land as a living system, who carried real responsibility for every acre of it. A sound from below pulled her attention, a tenant farmer being shown into the library, clearly distressed, his hat twisting nervously in his hands. "My lord, forgive me for intruding like this," the farmer said. "It is no trouble, Tobias," the Earl said, his voice softer now, less formal. "What has happened?" "It is the upper meadow, my lord, the one bordering Hartfield. The old culvert has blocked again after the storm. The water is rising fast. It will ruin the grazing if we cannot clear it soon." Caroline froze where she stood. She knew that exact culvert, her own tenant, Mr. Marsh, had complained of the very same trouble from his side of the boundary, a shared problem the two estates had always managed together in quiet cooperation. The Earl looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the library. A moment of sudden, unexpected connection passing between them, the grand dispute over the Ashworth collection, suddenly feeling absurdly distant beside this very real and pressing problem. "My own tenant has reported the same flooding," Caroline said, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet room. The Earl turned back to the farmer. "Tell Marsh to meet you at the culvert at dawn tomorrow. Bring 2 strong men with shovels. I will be there myself." Then he looked back up at her, a silent question in his eyes that needed no words. "I will be there as well," she said. For the first time since her arrival, something close to a smile flickered across his face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "Very good," he said simply, and returned to his papers. The next morning was cold and damp, mist hanging thick over the fields. Caroline walking from Brenmore in a sturdy gown and boots, a groom trailing respectfully behind her. At the boundary hedge she found them already at work, The Earl with his sleeves rolled and his shirt already spattered with mud, holding a shovel as if he had done this work his entire life. For 2 hours they labored together, the Earl alongside the farmers, digging through thick clay to clear the blocked stones, while Caroline directed her own groom on her side, pointing out a secondary blockage causing the real trouble. She watched him work with quiet, focused intensity, listening carefully to the farmers, treating their knowledge with genuine respect rather than condescension. When a heavy buried stone refused to budge, she called out across the hedge, "There is a fissure on its underside. If you set the lever from the east side, it should give way." He looked at her, then at the stone, and nodded for the crowbar to be positioned exactly as she described, and with a final heave the rock broke free, sending a rush of pent-up water surging through the cleared channel. The farmers cheered, and one of them turned to Caroline with a grin. "You have the eye of your father for this, miss, you surely do." The Earl walked to the hedge, wiping mud from his hands. "My thanks, Miss Hartfield. You saved us another hour of work at the very least." "It is my land too," she said simply, "and the livelihood of my tenants as much as yours." He looked at her then with something new in his expression, not the cool, assessing look of a rival, but something closer to genuine respect. "You have a remarkable understanding of drainage for a lady of your position," he said. "One learns what one must," she replied evenly. A thoughtful silence settled between them, broken only by the gentle gurgle of the freshly cleared stream, no longer the hostile silence of strangers, but something quieter and far more uncertain. "I should return to she said suddenly, feeling the impropriety of standing alone with him in an open field. "Of course," he said, making no move to stop her. But as she turned away, he spoke again, "Caroline." She stopped where she stood, her back to him, hearing her given name spoken aloud for the first time in his low, steady voice, startlingly intimate in the open air. She turned back slowly. "Nathaniel," she replied, testing the sound of his name on her own tongue. The faint smile returned, more certain this time. "The repairs at Hartfield," he said. "I have seen the latest report from Bramwell. I believe the surveyor has badly overestimated the cost of timber required." She stared at him. "Surprised you have seen the report from the surveyor. Bramwell and my own steward have been conferring. It seemed efficient to review it myself," he said carefully. "My saw pits hold a surplus of seasoned oak, far more economical than purchasing timber elsewhere. They are entirely at your disposal." It was an offer of extraordinary generosity, one that could save her thousands of pounds, and one that would put her deeply in his debt. And yet he spoke of it as casually as discussing the weather. "I cannot possibly accept such charity," she stammered, pride warring openly with the relief his offer represented. "It is not charity," he said firmly. "Hartfield borders my own land. A ruined house at my boundary is a blight on the landscape and a danger to the entire community. Repairing it swiftly serves my own interests as much as yours. I will sell you the timber at cost. Nothing more than an ordinary transaction." He had framed it perfectly, giving her a way to accept without feeling she had surrendered anything, and she realized with a small jolt that he was being kind in the only way his pride would allow. "Then, on those terms," she said quietly, "I accept and I thank you. It is nothing," he said, and with a final nod turned and strode away across the meadow, leaving her standing beside the boundary hedge, the sound of running water filling the silence around her, the foundations of her certainty shifting just as surely as that stone in the stream. The timber arrangement created an entirely new kind of traffic between the two estates, carts loaded with seasoned oak, rumbling up the drive to Hartfield, and with them came an increasing number of meetings between the Earl and his unexpected guest. They began meeting, almost by unspoken agreement, in the Brenmore Library, a place that had quietly become neutral ground, a space of maps and ledgers where the old, formal dispute seemed to lose some of its power. Caroline found herself looking forward to these meetings more than she cared to admit, to the quiet satisfaction of sitting across from him at the great table, their heads bent together over the same set of plans. He was, she discovered, a man of extraordinary intelligence, his grasp of construction, finance, and law every bit as deep as his understanding of agriculture, and he never once spoke down to her, treating her opinions as those of an equal. One evening, as they finished discussing the new roof trusses, he looked up from the plans, the Ashworth collection. He said without warning. Her spine stiffened instantly. "Yes," she said carefully. "The books will need to be moved while the work on the wing continues. It is not safe to leave them there," he said. "I am aware," she said coolly. "I intend to have them packed and stored in the cellars at Marrowfield." "The cellars are damp," he said, not as criticism, but simple fact. "You will risk mildew and ruin to the pages. It would be a tragedy to see them damaged beyond repair." He paused. "The records room here at Brenmore is dry and secure. It stands empty except for old family papers. The collection would be entirely safe there until your library is rebuilt." She stared at him, momentarily speechless. He was offering to take the very collection they were disputing into his own house, where she would have no direct control over it. The audacity of it was breathtaking. "You wish me to move the contested property onto your own land?" she asked, disbelief sharp in her voice. "I wish to see it preserved," he corrected gently. "The dispute is a matter of legal title. It has no bearing on the value of the books themselves. They are a treasure to this entire county, no matter whose name sits on the deed. Let us, for now, simply agree to be joint custodians of their safety." Joint custodians, the phrase hung in the air between them. He was not trying to seize the library. He was trying to save it, and trusting her enough to believe that. "And what of your claim?" she asked, testing him carefully. "My claim will remain exactly as strong or as weak as it is now," he said, "and so will yours. This is a practical matter, not a legal one, however. If you do not trust me, I will understand completely." She thought of the careful notes in his books, of his hands muddy from clearing their shared stream, of the way he had framed the timber offer to protect her pride. He fought for what he believed was rightfully his, but he fought with honor. He was not a man who would steal in the dark. "Very well," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I accept your offer. We will be joint custodians." A look of unmistakable relief crossed his face before he could hide it. "Thank you," he said simply. The days that followed were filled with careful, dusty work, packing thousands of volumes from the damaged wing under his precise direction, a strange partnership born entirely of necessity. She noticed he handled each book with the same reverence she felt herself, pointing out a rare first edition he thought might interest her, a set of botanical illustrations he knew she would treasure. One afternoon, as they carefully wrapped a heavy folio of antique maps, their hands brushed together for the briefest moment, the lightest touch sending an unexpected jolt through her entire body. She pulled her hand back quickly, refusing to look at him, but feeling the air between them grow suddenly charged with something new and unspoken. That evening, their solicitor, Mr. Quillen, arrived to draw up the formal paperwork acknowledging the temporary move of the collection, a portly, smooth-talking man whose manner Caroline found increasingly unsettling. "Your lordship, Miss Hartfield," he beamed as he entered. "What a splendid example of neighborly cooperation in such difficult times, a model for the entire county." "We are merely being practical, Quillen," Nathaniel said, his tone dry. Of course, but it does warm an old heart," Quillen said, settling himself at the table and spreading his papers. "Now, as to the collection, I have prepared a simple receipt acknowledging that Brenmore holds the books on behalf of Marrowfield, with no prejudice to the underlying claim of either party." He slid the document toward Caroline, and as she reached for the pen, he spoke again, almost conversationally. "A shame, though, that this business with the roof has weakened your position so, Miss Hartfield." She looked up sharply. "I do not see how, my dear lady." He sighed sympathetically. "You are now a guest inside the home of the Earl. Accepting his timber, his assistance, it creates an appearance of dependency, and in the eyes of the law, Such appearances can matter. A court might well see it as quiet acknowledgement of his stronger claim. A cold knot formed deep inside Caroline. That is absurd. His lordship has offered help as a neighbor, nothing more. Of course, Quillan soothed. But you know how these things look. His lordship is concerned. He mentioned to me only last week how delicate the situation has become, how he worried you might feel beholden to him. Caroline stared at the solicitor, then slowly turned her head to look at Nathaniel. His face had gone cold with fury. "Quillan," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "you will be silent." But the damage was already done. The words had poisoned everything between them in an instant. Had his generosity been calculated all along, a way to weaken her position and make her appear a poor relation? "Is this true?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Did you say this to him?" "No," Nathaniel said, his eyes locked on hers. "I did not." "But you thought it," she whispered, her wounded pride hardening quickly into anger. "You offered me shelter, you offered me timber. All while knowing it weakened my position, you used my misfortune against me." "That is not true," he said, rising from his chair. "Quillan is twisting my words entirely. I expressed concern that you might feel uncomfortable, that this situation was difficult for you." "A subtle distinction indeed," she shot back, standing and pushing the unsigned document away. "The books will remain at Marrowfield. I will find a way to protect them myself. I will not be your debtor, your lordship, not in timber, and not in trust." She turned and walked toward the door, her back straight, refusing to look at him, unable to bear what she imagined must be triumph on his face. "Caroline, wait," he called after her. But she did not stop. Fleeing the library and retreating to the cold sanctuary of the East Wing, certain now she had been a fool to ever trust him. The days that followed were colder than any before them, a wall of silence rising between the two wings of the house, communication reduced to brief, formal notes carried by servants. Work on the Marrowfield roof continued with timber from the saw pits of Brenmore, but now every plank felt like another coin added to a growing debt of humiliation. Caroline avoided the library entirely, taking her meals alone, the gentle attempts of Mrs. Pemberton at conversation falling into worried silence, the memory of that evening playing over and over in her mind. Had he truly meant to deceive her, or had her own pride simply heard what it expected to hear? One afternoon a message arrived from the local vicar, Mr. Sefton. A fever had broken out in the village. In a small cluster of cottages sitting half on Marrowfield land and half on Brenmore land, several families ill, including the family of her own tenant, Mr. Marsh, the doctor overwhelmed and badly in need of help. Without hesitation, Caroline gathered a basket of soup and clean linens from the kitchens and set out for the village immediately. At the Marsh cottage the scene was grim, his wife desperately trying to tend two feverish children while her husband shivered beneath a pile of blankets in the corner of the room. Caroline set to work at once, her personal turmoil forgotten entirely in the face of real and urgent need, bathing the faces of the two children with cool water, coaxing spoonfuls of broth between their cracked lips. She had been there nearly an hour when the cottage door opened, and Nathaniel walked in carrying a heavy medical chest, stopping short at the sight of her, clear surprise written across his face. "Miss Hartfield," he said quietly. "Your lordship," she replied. In this small room, surrounded by genuine suffering, their personal quarrel suddenly felt petty and insignificant. He asked her nothing, simply crossed the room and knelt beside her tenant, placing a cool hand against the burning forehead of the sick man. "The vicar sent for me," he explained softly. "The doctor is occupied at the far end of the village. He asked me to bring quinine and laudanum." For the rest of that long day they worked side by side, a silent and efficient team, he tending the men with his strength, helping move them into more comfortable positions, while she cared for the women and children, her quiet patience calming the frightened. They spoke very little, anticipating the needs of each other without words, passing cloths and cups of water and bottles of medicine, as though they had worked together their entire lives. Late that evening, the last patient finally settled. They stood together outside in the cold night air, exhausted, the moon high above the sleeping village. "You should not have been here," Nathaniel said. His voice rough with fatigue. "It was a real risk. The fever could easily have spread to you." "They are my people," Caroline replied simply. "As they are yours, there was no choice in the matter." He looked at her for a long moment, his face shadowed in the moonlight. "No," he said softly, "there was not." He hesitated, then continued, the words seeming pulled from somewhere deep within him. "Quillen lied to you, Caroline." She looked away toward the distant lights of Brenmore. "Did he?" "Yes," he said, "I have dismissed him. He will no longer act for my family or my estate in any matter." The news struck her with genuine shock. Dismissing a solicitor whose family had served his for generations was an almost unheard of step. "Why?" she asked. "Because he tried to profit from our dispute," he said. "Because he used your misfortune to secure his own position, and because he lied about me to you. And no doubt about you to me as well," he added, taking a step closer. "For years, he has been the very channel through which our families misunderstood each other. He nurtured this grievance because the grievance paid his bills." Caroline thought of every letter, every carefully worded insult and demand, all filtered through one self-serving man. Had their entire history of bitterness been quietly shaped by him alone? "I never said I thought you beholden to me," Nathaniel continued, his voice low and intense. "I told Quillen only that I had placed you in an impossible position, that I regretted it deeply, that any woman of pride would resent being forced to accept help from an adversary, and that I admired you greatly for it." He paused. "He took my respect for you and twisted it into a weapon against you, and for that I will never forgive him." She looked at him then and saw not the cold, arrogant earl she had once imagined, but a man of deep and unbending integrity who had just defended her honor and his own at significant personal cost. "I believe you," she said softly. The words a quiet admission of her own mistake. "I should have believed you in the library. My pride heard only what it expected to hear." "We have both been ruled by pride," he said, "and by a history that was never truly ours to carry." A silence fell between them, but it was a silence rich with new understanding. "The books," she said suddenly, "they are still in the damaged wing. It is not secure there." "I know," he said. "You should have them moved to your records room," she said, an apology, an act of trust, and a peace offering all woven into one simple sentence. "I will send the men first thing tomorrow," he replied gently. "We will be joint custodians." He offered her his arm, and after only a brief hesitation, she took it, and together they began the long walk back to Brenmore, two former adversaries who had found, in the crucible of shared crisis, an unexpected and fragile truce. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere at Brenmore changed entirely, the invisible walls between the wings dissolving completely. Caroline no longer confined to her apartments, but moving freely throughout the house. They began dining together each evening, often with Mrs. Pemberton present as a silent, approving chaperone, their conversations drifting easily from timber and roof repairs to books, music, and the future of farming itself. Caroline discovered a sharp, dry wit hidden beneath his reserved exterior, and he, in turn, seemed to delight in her quick and incisive mind. One evening, over a dish of roasted pheasant, he told her a story from his university days, a foolish wager involving a borrowed horse and a midnight race across 3 counties that had nearly ended in disaster. And Caroline laughed so freely that Mrs. Pemberton looked up from her own plate in genuine surprise, having rarely heard such open delight from her in years. He watched her laugh with an expression she could not quite name, something between wonder and tenderness, and when their eyes met across the candlelight, neither looked away as quickly as propriety demanded. The collection was moved with great care to the Brenmore records room, and on the day the last crate was sealed, Nathaniel handed her a small brass key. "For your half of the custodianship," he said, a faint smile playing at his lips, and she took it, their fingers brushing for a second longer than was strictly necessary. Repairs at Hartfield proceeded at a pace that would have been impossible without his help. Caroline riding over every other day to supervise the work, and more often than not, he would find some reason to accompany her, walking through the half-restored rooms discussing the placement of a window or the repair of an old cornice. On one such afternoon, as the autumn light slanted gold through the new glass of the West Gallery, Nathaniel paused beside a half-finished wall and asked her quietly about her father, what kind of man he had truly been beyond the scholar everyone in the county remembered him as. Caroline found herself speaking more openly than she had with anyone in years, describing the long winter evenings spent reading beside the fire while her father lost himself in old manuscripts, the way he had never once raised his voice, even when the accounts grew impossible, the way he had taught her to see numbers not as a burden, but as a puzzle waiting to be solved. He listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful, and when she finally asked about his own father in return, his answer surprised her, a man of duty above all else, who had loved the land fiercely but rarely spoke of feelings, who had taught Nathaniel that responsibility was the truest form of affection a man could offer. "We were both raised by men who loved quietly," she said softly. "Perhaps that is why this quarrel suited our family so well. It gave us something loud to feel when everything else was so terribly restrained." He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his calm grey eyes. "Perhaps you are right," he said. "Perhaps a feud is simply grief that never found another shape to wear." They walked on in silence after that, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that asked nothing and gave everything, and Caroline noticed that he had begun to slow his pace whenever they crossed a threshold together, allowing her to enter the room first, a small courtesy she suspected he was not even aware of offering. The workmen grew used to the sight of the two of them moving through the half-finished house, the Earl in his shirt sleeves more often than not, sketching measurements on scraps of paper. Caroline beside him with a ledger tucked under her arm, and more than once she caught Mrs. Pemberton watching them from a doorway with an expression that was equal parts hope and worry. "You are spending a great deal of time with his lordship," Mrs. Pemberton observed one evening, her tone carefully neutral as she helped Caroline unpin her hair. "We are merely rebuilding a house," Caroline said, though even as she spoke the words she felt how hollow they sounded. Mrs. Pemberton said nothing further, only smiled in the manner of a woman who had seen a great many things in her long life and recognized this particular thing immediately for what it was. It was during these weeks that Caroline began to notice small changes in herself. The way she found herself dressing with more care in the mornings, the way a single glimpse of him crossing the lawn could quiet whatever worry had kept her awake the night before, the way she had begun, without quite meaning to, measuring every other man she met against him and finding them all somehow lacking in comparison. In a strange and unexpected way, rebuilding her house had become a shared project between them, and Caroline slowly began to understand that she was falling in love, a quiet, unnerving realization that crept up on her gradually. He was still the ancestral enemy of her family. He still held a legal claim to her most precious inheritance. And yet her heart had stopped remembering these facts, remembering instead only the man who had worked beside her in a muddy field, who had tended her sick tenants without hesitation, who looked at her not as a rival, but as an equal. She began spending her afternoons in the Brenmore Library, not for any research, but driven by a new and urgent curiosity to understand how this entire feud had truly begun, searching not the curated history of solicitors, but something closer to the source. She found what she was searching for, not in the main library, but in a dusty, forgotten corner of the Hartfield attics, where the personal papers of her father had long been stored, a small leather-bound journal kept by her great-grandfather, Edmund Hartfield. She carried it back to Brenmore and, with a growing sense of dread, began to read. The story that unfolded within its pages was not one of bitterness at all, but of deep and profound friendship. Edmund Hartfield and Reginald Ashgrove, the own great-grandfather of Nathaniel, had been inseparable since their earliest days at university, traveling together, standing as the closest companions of each other through every stage of life. The journal was filled with warm affection for his dearest friend. Until the tone shifted sharply, Edmund had made a series of disastrous investments, facing not just poverty but public disgrace and the very real threat of a prison for debtors. And then came the entry that changed everything she thought she knew. "Reginald came to me today," Edmund had written. "He knows everything. I expected only condemnation, or worse, pity. Instead, he arrived with a plan, a strange and wonderful plan. He intends to invent a legal claim against me, a fictitious debt with the Ashworth collection as collateral. He will press this claim publicly, and the world will believe us estranged. And under the cover of this invented dispute, he will be able to send funds to me, not as charity, but disguised as settlement for other equally fictitious dealings. It will save my estate. It will save my honor. He is sacrificing his own good name, so the county believes him a grasping creditor, all to save me. There is no greater friend than this. The world will see only a feud, but we and God will know it for what it truly is, an act of love." Caroline sat there, the journal open in her lap, the faded ink burning with a truth that dismantled an entire century of lies in a single moment. The feud had been a fabrication from the very beginning, a shield, a performance designed to protect the honor of one friend through the sacrifice of another. For generations, both families had nursed a grievance that had never been real, inheriting the performance while forgetting the reason behind it entirely. The very letters Mr. Quillen had used as evidence were nothing more than part of a script written for a public audience. Her first instinct was to run straight to Nathaniel and reveal everything at once. But she stopped herself. This was the honor of his family as much as her own. His great-grandfather had chosen to bear the scorn of the entire world in complete silence, and revealing the truth now might expose the secret shame of her own family, the very thing his ancestor had given so much to protect. What was the right thing to do? Continue the quiet performance out of respect for the dead, or bring the truth into the light and finally set their own generation free from it? She was still wrestling with this very question when a new complication arrived in the person of Sir Aldous Frayne. Sir Aldous was a neighboring landowner, a wealthy widower who had made his interest in Caroline quite clear for some time now, and with her now in residence at Brenmore, his visits became increasingly frequent. He was handsome, charming, and unfailingly agreeable, and he was a vocal supporter of her side in the long dispute with the Earl. "You are a paragon of patience, Miss Hartfield," he said one afternoon, as they sat together in the drawing-room, Nathaniel having been called away to London on urgent business for a few days. "To endure the hospitality of the Earl while he continues to press such an outrageous claim, I admire your strength a great deal." "The Earl has been very kind," Caroline said, her tone cooler than she intended. Kind Sir Aldous laughed lightly. "My dear lady, he is an Ashgrove. They are known throughout the county for their arrogance. He is merely playing a part, biding his time. Do not trust him. Your father certainly would not have." His words, meant as sympathy, landed instead like an attack, echoing the old false narrative she now knew to be a lie, and she saw him then not as a suitor, but as a representative of a world that had misunderstood the truth for an entire century. When Nathaniel returned from London, he found Sir Aldous a near-permanent fixture in his own house, arriving for tea and staying well into dinner, his flattery of Caroline and subtle digs at Nathaniel a constant, grating presence. Nathaniel endured it with cold, impeccable courtesy that Caroline recognized as a mask, hiding a steadily growing fury. The breaking point arrived one evening in the drawing-room, Sir Aldous once again lamenting the injustice of the Ashgrove claim. "It is a matter of principle," he declared. looking at Caroline with soulful eyes. An inheritance belonging to a lady should be untouchable. For the Earl to use his position and power to take what is rightfully hers, it is simply dishonorable. Before Caroline could respond, Nathaniel spoke. Standing by the fireplace, his face carved from stone, "Sir Aldous," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable ring of command. "You are a guest in my home. You will not speak of my honor or the lack of it, beneath my own roof." Sir Aldous flushed red. "I speak only of what the entire county already knows to be true. You speak of things you understand nothing about," Nathaniel said, stepping forward. "The matter between Miss Hartfield and myself is exactly that. A matter between the two of us. It does not concern you, and your opinion is not required here." "I have every right to my own opinion," Sir Aldous blustered, rising to his feet, "and a right to defend the interests of a lady when they are under attack." "Miss Hartfield is more than capable of defending her own interests," Nathaniel said, his voice dropping dangerously low. "She requires no champion, particularly one so poorly informed." The insult was deliberate and unmistakable, a clear challenge, and Sir Aldous paled before puffing out his chest in indignation. "I see how it is now. You will not bully me, Brenmore, nor will you blind Miss Hartfield with this pretense of civility. I will take my leave, Miss Hartfield," he said, turning to her with a dramatic bow. "When you have need of a true friend, you know precisely where to find me." He stormed from the room, leaving a tense and heavy silence behind him. Caroline looked at Nathaniel. He had not defended his claim at all. He had defended her competence, her strength, her right to fight her own battles, and he had risked a public quarrel with a wealthy and influential neighbor entirely on her behalf. "Thank you," she said softly. He turned to face her, the anger slowly draining from his expression, leaving only weariness behind. "I am sorry you were subjected to that," he said. "He meant well, I suppose," she said, though she did not truly believe it. "He meant to win your favor by echoing your own prejudices," Nathaniel corrected her. "He thinks you are a woman who needs flattery and rescue. He does not see you at all." He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "I see you, Caroline." The simple words struck her more powerfully than any grand declaration could have. He saw her, the capable, intelligent, stubborn woman who had argued with him over drainage plans and worked beside him to save a dying child, and in that moment she knew exactly what she had to do. The truth was not a weapon, she realized. It was a key, capable of unlocking them both from the prison of a past belonging to both their families. "Nathaniel," she said, her heart pounding, "there is something you must see, something that will change everything between us." She went to her room and returned carrying the journal of her great-grandfather, opening it to the marked page and handing it to him. "Read this," she said. He took it, a frown of confusion crossing his face as he began to read. She watched closely as the story unfolded before him, his frown deepening, his eyes widening in disbelief, the slow dawn of comprehension followed by shock, and then a deep, aching sadness. He read the entry twice, then slowly lifted his eyes to meet hers, his expression filled with a century of undeserved shame belonging to his family. "All this time," he whispered, "all this time we were guarding the honor of your family, and we did not even know it ourselves." He looked down at the journal again, then back at her. "My great-grandfather, he carried the scorn of the entire county for this, and my great-grandfather let him," Caroline said softly. "They were the dearest of friends. It was a pact between the two of them alone." Nathaniel sank slowly into a chair, the journal held loosely in his hand. "The feud," he murmured. "It was an act of love all along." He looked around the room, at the very house that had been built atop the foundations of that noble lie, and we have been nothing but its unwitting jailers. He looked up at her, his expression raw with unguarded vulnerability. "What do we do now?" he asked. The question was not truly about the library at all. It was about the two of them, the last heirs to this strange and quietly tragic story. "We tell the truth," Caroline said, her voice clear and strong, "not to the world. The world does not need to know any of this. We tell it only to each other. We end the performance, and we let them rest in peace, together." He stood and came to her, taking her hands in his, warm and strong. "And the collection?" he asked. "The collection," she said, a smile finally breaking through. "It is a monument to a great friendship. It belongs to both of us, or to neither of us." "To both of us," he said, his voice thick with emotion, raising her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "Caroline Hartfield, will you do me the honor of helping me end this ridiculous, noble, century-long war once and for all?" "I will," she whispered. "If this moment just made your heart skip a beat, you are exactly the kind of person who needs to hit that follow button right now, because stories like this one are coming your way every single day, and trust me, you do not want to miss what happens next, so stay close." The final resolution was quiet and entirely private, handled not by solicitors, but between the two of them in the Brenmore Library, the very place where they had first truly come to know one another. Nathaniel, through a formal letter sent only to her, officially and permanently withdrew the claim belonging to the Ashgrove family on the Ashworth collection, making no mention of the journal at all, stating only that new historical evidence had come to light proving the claim of his family to be without merit. It was a public act of concession, one that would surely cause whispers throughout the county, one that would make him appear weak in the eyes of men like Sir Aldous, and it was, in truth, his own quiet act of peace. Caroline, in turn, wrote her own letter, proposing that the Ashworth collection, now indisputably hers, should not return to Marrowfield at all. Instead, she wished to gift it entirely to a new trust, charged with establishing a public lending library in the county town, governed by a board of trustees, and she requested that the Earl of Brenmore consent to serve as chairman of this new board. It was her own act of peace, transforming the very object of their long dispute into a shared gift for the entire community, and he accepted without hesitation. The day the last workman finally left Marrowfield, Caroline walked slowly through her fully restored home, beautiful once again, the scars of the storm completely healed, the rooms bright and airy, her home secure and whole once more. But it felt strangely quiet now, and she found herself standing in the empty Ashworth wing, just a handsome vacant room, the books gone, the dispute gone, the long war finally over, and she had never in her life felt quite so lonely. There was a crunch of carriage wheels on the drive outside, and she went to the window to see the Brenmore carriage arriving, Nathaniel himself swinging down from the seat of the driver without waiting for assistance. He met her in the hall, holding a single leather-bound book. "A housewarming gift," he said, holding it out to her. "It was the first edition of Milton from the collection, but this belongs to the trust," she said, confused. "The trustees met this very morning," he said, a ghost of a smile crossing his face. The chairman exercised his discretion. He felt the very first book in the new Marrowfield library should be an old and trusted friend. She took the book carefully, her fingers tracing the gold leaf along its spine. "Thank you," she said. "Caroline," he said, his voice suddenly serious, "I have grown quite accustomed to your company. Brenmore feels far too quiet without you in it now." She looked up at him, her heart plain in her eyes. "Marrowfield is too quiet as well," she admitted. "I have a proposal," he said, taking a deep breath, "a final treaty to end all hostilities between us, a permanent union of our two estates, not through any legal claim, but through marriage." He looked at her then, his pride entirely stripped away, leaving only a man both vulnerable and full of hope, Caroline Hartfield. "I have come to believe my life would be a cold and empty thing without you in it. Will you be my wife?" She did not need a single moment to think. She had known the answer for weeks already. The war had ended some time ago, but the peace she realized now was only just beginning. "Yes," she said, "yes, Nathaniel, I will." 1 year later, the Brenmore and Hartfield Library opened its doors to the public for the very first time. A handsome new building standing proudly in the center of the county town, its shelves lined with the books of the Ashworth collection. On a simple brass plaque beside the entrance A single inscription read, "In memory of a great friendship." The Earl and Countess of Brenmore stood together among the crowd at the opening ceremony, side by side. He the master of Brenmore Hall, she the mistress of Marrowfield, yet they lived together now, moving easily between the two estates, as though crossing a single shared room. The old boundary line that had divided their families for an entire century was now nothing more than a line on a map. An elderly tenant farmer from the village approached them, hat in hand. "It is a wonderful thing you have done, my lord, my lady," he said, gazing around the library in quiet awe. "All these books for the likes of us." Nathaniel smiled, a real and warm smile that reached all the way to his eyes, wrapping his arm around the waist of his wife. "It was the idea of my wife," he said. "She is the one with true vision." Caroline leaned her head against his shoulder. "It was a joint effort," she corrected him gently, "as all the best things truly are." Later that evening they sat together in the library at Brenmore Hall, a fire burning warmly in the hearth, the single volume of Milton resting quietly on the table between them. The old war was now nothing more than a distant memory, its true history known only to the two of them, the disputed object transformed completely into a gift, the old enmity transformed entirely into love, and two proud, stubborn people had, by finally looking past the stories they had been told their whole lives, found in their greatest adversary their truest and most enduring friend. Thank you so much for staying with this story all the way to its very end. You truly made this journey worthwhile, so please tell me down in the comments which city you are watching from tonight, and what this story made you feel inside. And if you want more stories just like this one waiting for you tomorrow, do not, I will be here again with something new, and I cannot wait to share it with you.